Welcome back, beautiful people. Super blessed to be back with you guys. It's another installment of the African Comic Guy. And I'm excited about today actually because we actually get to start on this journey, this comic world journey. And I love the fact that we're getting started with one of my favorite characters, one of my favorite superheroes that I'm pretty sure a lot of you are very unfamiliar with. As a matter of fact, if you're actually familiar with this character, I want you to comment down below. Let me know how, let me know when, let me know if this particular character resonates with you. And I'd love to actually just hear from this particular character. Actually means a lot as far as my journey when it comes to comics. And I can't wait to share it. So without further ado, let's cue the intro. I'm obviously talking about the Phantom. Now, a lot of you don't know the Phantom, but you're about to. So let's talk about it. Now, the Phantom is actually an American adventure comic, first published by a gentleman by the name of Lee Falk in 1936. And I love the fact that this particular character of the Phantom, lived in a fictional country called Bangalia. Where have you heard that before? Allah Wakanda. And he actually fought his enemies, and he was basically a crime fighter in this fictional country called Bengali. Now, my introduction to this character actually came in the form of newspapers, because I remember this particular comic was actually featured in the Sunday Nation, and I'll put a clip up here. For those of you who are Kenyan, I don't know if you remember this, but every Sunday, I remember I used to wait for my dad to be done with the newspaper because I wanted to read this particular comic. I wanted to find out what the Phantom was actually doing this particular week, or I knew where the story was going, and I wanted to find out where how far he'd gone. And as you can see from this clip, not only was the Phantom featured, but other characters. One particular, if you notice, that I'm actually going to hit on a little bit later. But that's how I got introduced. And the funny thing was, this particular comic, The Phantom, was actually published globally and was actually read by over 100 million people globally. So depending on where you lived on this planet, you probably came across this comic either daily or once a week like we did. So this particular comic became extremely popular. And over the last almost 8 decades, there have been a lot of iterations of this comic, but it's always good to see that a comic that actually started so long ago resonated with a lot of people globally. Now, the story of the Phantom actually started in 1556 when a British sailor by the name of Christopher Walker was actually murdered by pirates. And what ended up happening was his son, going through trauma, going through heartache, going through grief, swore an oath on the dead skull of his father's murderer, and thus became the Phantom. Now, what I love about it is because throughout the centuries, the Phantom was passed down from father to son, and unintentionally created this myth that this particular character of the Phantom was immortal, which obviously was not true. The thing you need to know about the Phantom is, number one, he does not have superpowers. And so he relies on his intelligence, relies on his strength, but also relies on the fact that a lot of people, including criminals, believe that this man cannot die. So he used that to his advantage. You know, I look at Batman with no superpowers, but he uses his best weapon, his mind. And so did the Phantom. Now, over the years, he's actually been, he's had different names. Different people have known him by different names, and he's had different nicknames. One of the most popular ones that I actually grew up with was the Ghost Who Walks. You know, there was an animation back in the 1980s, early 1990s that actually depicted this character, and I grew up watching it. And it used to come on, and the title used to be The Ghost Who Walks. You know, and obviously another nickname of his was The Man Who Cannot Die, or The Man Who Can't Die. So it's actually pretty interesting. The Phantom actually got married while being the Phantom. Not only that, he decided to start a family. Now, if you know anything about comics, a lot of superheroes tend to really refrain or at least stay away from creating really close ties with anyone, because being a hero means you're a target. So you don't want anybody close to you to become a target. So if you look at a lot of superheroes, they choose to live, I don't want to say lonely life, but it's kind of like being a lone wolf, But he actually decided to get married, and married a girl called Diana, had 2 kids, and basically raised a family while being a Phantom. So that says a lot about this particular character. Another thing was not to confuse these 2 characters as pets, but he had 2 partners. And these 2 partners happened to be a wolf and a horse. And like I said, do not confuse them for pets, because they were not. He actually trained them both. And if you go through the comics over the years, you'd actually realize that these 2 actually had lives of their own. So they were actually characters along this major character. So he respected them and loved them not as pets, but as partners. Another thing was not to confuse these 2 characters as pets, but he had 2 partners. And these 2 partners happened to be a wolf and a horse. And like I said, do not confuse them for pets, because they were not. He actually trained them both. And if you Another thing that reminds me about Batman is the fact that the Phantom actually lived in a cave as well. And this particular cave happened to be in the shape of a skull. And you see it up here. Did you know that the Phantom was actually the first comic book character ever to wear skin-tight costumes? I mean, skin-tight costumes basically epitomize books right now. I mean, if you think about Spider-Man, how many of you remember when Peter Parker was designing his costume, his uniform? Everything spandex, everything spandex. It's the craziest thing, right? And it all started from the Phantom. Now, this is an interesting thing, because one thing that people love about costumes or superhero costumes is the fact that each character, each costume embodies this particular character, right? Bruce Wayne, brooding, dark, Batman, right? Captain America, so patriotic. His uniform, basically, it's like his shield, his uniform says so much about not only who he is, but also the fact that he is incredibly patriotic to the United States. So it's just one of those interesting facts about the Phantom. And another thing about his particular uniform was the fact that his uniform, his costume, was originally not supposed to be purple. Now, you obviously noticed that it is, but it wasn't initially supposed to be purple. Lee Falk, the writer, actually designed this particular character to wear a gray costume. But what happened was, when he gave a colorist this particular to basically color this reel on a newspaper, that colorist decided to use purple, not gray. Now, something interesting about this particular comic is the fact that the Phantom doesn't necessarily belong to any one studio, right? A lot of us are familiar with DC and Marvel. There are a host of other studios out there. But a lot of these studios, including DC and Marvel, have used the Phantom to tell stories, either in animation, in movie, in comic books as well, along with other major publications along the decades. So I love the fact that the Phantom is a story that can be adopted by multiple studios, multiple people, if you can actually acquire the rights, whether temporarily or whatever. And it almost feels like it belongs to us, because outside of Lee Falk, the original publisher, did you know that the Phantom was actually in the movies in 1996, and it was actually portrayed, the actor who portrayed this particular character was Billy Zane. Now, a lot of you who do know Billy Zane, you probably know him from Titanic and a multitude of other movies. And I loved that movie because, a lot of times you have actors who portray a particular character and you're like, yeah, doesn't necessarily fit. And then there's some, and you're like, it fits. Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man. I mean, could you actually see anybody else portraying Iron Man the way he did? He made us believe Iron Man was real. We're not as popular as Batman and Superman, but he did, and he did it really well. Now, it wasn't as successful as they expected it to be, but for me, I love the fact that this movie showcased a particular character for the first time in the movies, and that he actually did it justice. You know, it actually had like a DC type arc where it was gritty, it was dark, but it was also fun to watch. One of my favorite things about the Phantom is the fact that he also belonged to a superhero team. I mean, how many superhero teams do you know, right? A la the Avengers, Justice League, Justice Society of America. There's so many. But I love the fact that he belonged to a particular superhero team that I grew up watching, Defenders of the Earth. Now, for a lot of you, you actually remember Saturday morning. I used to wake up every Saturday morning to watch Defenders of the Earth because they were fun. And also because there was another particular character, another comic book character, that was featured among this particular superhero team by the name of Flash Gordon, one of my other favorite comic characters. And I can't wait to actually tackle this one. So in a few weeks, I'll be talking about Flash Gordon. Now, as much as this comic brought fun and entertainment to a lot of people, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that it also created some backlash. Now, again, as this comic grew globally, people accepted it. People loved the idea of a superhero who not only embodied a lot of them. Fighting crime is something a lot of people actually like, the fact that you have a particular character who has no powers, but decides to take on a role. He could die any day, but he decides to actually help people. But one thing it did, especially in the African continent, that it created a lot of backlash, because here came another character who happened to be white, moves to Africa to save Africans. So it didn't resonate with a lot of people at first, because it's created this age-old narrative that's been there, and being African, I actually understand it, because you have characters like Tarzan, right? White in Africa, saving Africans. So that particular narrative never resonates with, or never did resonate with, a lot of people. And so that was backlash. And again, I mean, you could call these initial writers tone deaf. They didn't necessarily understand the culture or the tradition. They didn't immerse themselves in culture and tradition. They were telling a story. And but what I mention this because even though I acknowledge the fact that it did rub people the wrong way, because there's a stereotype out there, and rightly so. But I also mention it because over the decades, after writer, after publisher, after writer, that people actually now are more sensitive. A lot of these writers, especially when they write newer Phantom stories, are very sensitive to the fact that you actually need to understand, or you actually have to have an understanding of a certain culture, a certain tradition. If you're telling a story from this point of view, you have to actually know it. You have to study it. You have to engage people and actually find out what works. And they've done that. So it hasn't stayed on that course. So I love that, because it says that there are people who noticed or realize, hey, we want to tell this story, but we actually have to tell it in a way that it connects with the people whom are depicted. A lot of them are depicted in this particular comic. So I love that. So it goes to show you that people actually not only adapt, but people realize, you know what, comics are supposed to be fun and entertaining. And when we realize we're not particularly hitting a certain note, we can go back, refresh, change, and not only change it for just comics, but also ourselves. Because at the end of the day, when you change a story, a lot of it is you realize, hey, if I'm going to tell this story, I need to understand a huge part of it. That way people can relate to this, and not just publishing something just to publish. So I love that it's come a long way. And if you actually pick up newer Phantom comics, you can actually see that. So again, I had to mention that because you always have to put context to a lot of things when people say, hey, maybe I didn't want to read it because it depicted us like this, or these particular stories were weird, even though this is a fictional characters, but you're talking about a fictional country in Africa. So it's kind of like one of those things where when you watched Wakanda, one of the things I was waiting to see, being African, being Kenyan, was how they were going to portray this particular character. And I love the fact that they went full on. You know what I mean? Like if you watched Black Panther, you could see the garments. You could see everything, right? I love the fact that you could see elements of different cultures in this movie. You know what I mean? So it was truly African. That was really cool. And I think that's why it resonated with a lot of people. People actually saw it and realized, I can see myself in that dress. I can see this country in that necklace. So I had to mention this because it's actually important. What's a comic without controversy, right? There's always controversy. So I just had to mention that. If you know me, you know that I do love comics. And this was always going to be the first comic character that I was actually going to talk about. Now, obviously, this is brief and it's designed that way. It's designed to give you just enough information to understand a particular character, but also create curiosity, especially if you do love comics. If you've never picked up this particular comic book, how about you go? You'll learn so much, and you'll see how, especially the initial ones, you'll see how this particular comic is able to influence a lot of your, stable, your popular, right? Comics of today. It's almost a feeling of nostalgia talking about this particular character because it takes me back. It takes me back to those Sunday afternoons where my dad would send me to buy the newspaper. And this was back when people read newspapers, by the way. If you don't know what newspapers are, Google them. So he would pick up this newspaper, and I wouldn't read it because I had to take it back. My dad was very particular about it, so I had to wait for him to be done. And when he was done, I'd take this because now after he's done reading it, because I couldn't read it before because I used to cut it. I used to cut those papers and put them together, like a scrapbook. But I couldn't do that until he was actually done with the entire paper. So this comic took me back, just going through it, not only with you, but also myself recently. It took me back to moments of my childhood. And I could almost see myself, right, running to the shop, getting this particular newspaper, Sunday Nation, waiting, just waiting, anxiously waiting for him to be done with this newspaper so that I could actually take this page, read it, catch up on whatever the Phantom's been up to up until then, and then cut it up and put it in a scrapbook. So it does. So it means a lot. I hope that you've learned something today. I hope that you are entertained. And by the way, if these stories resonate with you, how about you like and subscribe to this content? We're starting off, but I know this journey is going to be fun. There's so many different ways we're going to talk about this. I'm going to be tackling so many different things in the comic world. And but the ones I love will be stories just like this about characters, especially characters that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. It's been a blast to do this. It's been fun. I hope you guys have an incredible rest of your week. Can't wait to see you guys next. This has been the African Comic Guy signing off. Peace.